justice delayed is justice denied. More broadly, do you understand and accept the point that Ms Mordaunt was making there, justice delayed being justice denied, and how delay itself can compound injustice in this context, the infected blood context?
Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, this appalling scandal has gone on for decades. I mean, people have been let down for decades by successive governments. People raised concerns. They were battered away and told nothing was wrong, nothing to see here, that wasn't right. People thought that they were being helped when in fact, as it turned out, they were being harmed. People asked for an inquiry, that was rejected before it was finally accepted. So I think over a succession of not just years but decades, justice has been denied to people. They haven't received the recognition that they need and deserve, and that's why I'm so pleased that the inquiry was established, that it's continuing its important work and hopefully will conclude soon, and the government is committed and I'm committed to acting as swiftly as possible.
And we'll come back to the question of government action. If we just go over the page to what Ms Mordaunt said about compensation, so you'll see the heading compensation for victims. She says in the second paragraph, second line, I believe it to be inevitable that the government will need to provide substantial compensation. The costs are likely to be high, and then there's reference to the Irish model. I believe we should begin preparing for this now before the inquiry reports. My officials are working with DHSC colleagues to consider approaches to compensation. Any decision on compensation will require careful consideration. And then she says, experience of other inquiries suggests that early action could save the government significant legal costs, as well as provide victims with compensation as soon as possible. Now, in relation to that sentence I've just read, you'll see Ms Mordaunt there identifying two benefits to early action. The first, a potential financial benefit to the government, and then the second, the provision of compensation to victims as soon as possible. I will come back later to this phrase, as soon as possible, but what Ms Mordaunt explained and accepted in her evidence was there she was looking at the question of what was the morally right and just thing to do. Would you accept that?
Well, obviously, Penny could best answer questions about what she was trying to get across in the letter. As far as I can see reading it now, there were three topics that she raised of substance. The first was continued funding for the inquiry, which has been delivered on with over £125 million to date being spent on the inquiry to make sure it could do this important work. The second was resolving an issue about parity of treatment between those impacted living in different parts of the United Kingdom. And again, that was resolved in spring of 2021 whilst I was Chancellor, with the provision of an extra £175 million of funding to do so. And the third topic was around compensation, where since that letter was written, interim compensation payments have been made to around 4,500 people, and as people are familiar, £100,000 each. There's a figure mentioned in here. Obviously, to date, over £500 million of those payments have been made, and as the letter itself says, any decision on compensation will require careful consideration, and there's further detail about how Penny envisaged that might happen. Obviously, lots of things have evolved since that letter, not least we've had Robert Falls the Chair's interim report, but also Robert Francis's report, which have a variety of suggestions which are slightly different to those mentioned in this letter, but again, they've been delivered on. And I think Penny Mordaunt herself said the three topics that she raised, all of which she was able to progress.
Yes, and obviously my questions are going to focus on the issue of progress in relation to compensation. Would you accept, and this is a question really about the position of the government as opposed to your own, because you didn't see the letter at the time, as you've explained, but would you agree that this letter indicates that the government was on notice back in 2020 of the likelihood, Ms Mordaunt uses a stronger word, inevitability, of the government needing to pay compensation?
Yes, what I would say is, obviously, in my role, it was not something that I was directly involved in, because these costs were not, or those forecasts had not been crystallised at that point. The inquiry had been established, it was doing its work, there had been no interim reports from the inquiry, and it wasn't my direct departmental responsibility in the way that it was Penny's, as she would be the responsible minister for it. It wasn't something that, as I said, I was directly involved in at the time, and I think probably because the work was still ongoing and it hadn't reached a point where those decisions on compensation had yet to be made, or any advice or recommendations from the inquiry or others had at that point not been made either.
Let's just look at Miss Mordaunt's follow-up letter, which is EIBS 40705. So this is the 21st of September 2020, so a couple of months later. If we just go to the bottom of the page in relation to compensation for victims, you'll see Ms Mordaunt repeating what she'd said about the inevitability of the government needing to provide substantial compensation. And then she says, and we've got the adverb firmly added now, I firmly believe that we should begin preparing for this now before the inquiry reports. And then if we go over the page, she suggests she'd like to meet with you or the Chief Secretary, and then says, I cannot stress enough the urgency of taking long overdue action on financial support and compensation. And then there's a handwritten addition from her suggesting there's ideas about a solution, and she'd been trying for some time to secure a meeting with you. This letter was not, I think, regarded in the same way as the previous letter. The first letter, your statement tells us, was regarded as being for information. This letter, your statement suggests, received a holding response. Is that right?
Yes, so to the best of my knowledge, this letter was dealt with by officials. It wasn't brought to my attention, and there was communication between, again, Cabinet Office officials and Treasury officials on the substance of it. Again, I am not directly aware of exactly what happened. My understanding is there was not a meeting that took place, but officials were in touch, and I'm not sure the reasons why that didn't happen. But from what I can tell and what records show is work was going on between the two different departments on resolving the issue raised in that letter above on the first page about the parity of treatment, which was a substantive and immediate issue at that moment. And again, that was resolved some months later. I think Penny's letter refers to the spending review. It was resolved reasonably soon thereafter, as I said, with a provision of about £175 million to resolve those disparities that had existed between people in different parts of the United Kingdom.
Would you accept...
And again, I just said it would be normal for matters of public spending to be dealt with by the Chief Secretary of the Treasury. That's entirely normal. So the Chancellor has a very broad remit. Chief Secretary to the Treasury's primary responsibility is public spending. I used to, as you indicated in your opening, had that job myself, and it would be entirely normal from matters strictly relating to public spending, where other departmental ministers were making inquiries or requests of the Treasury, that it would be the Chief Secretary who would deal with those. So that's entirely as one might expect.
Would you agree that this letter indicates that certainly as at the autumn of 2020, the government's on notice that the question of compensation is something that's both urgent and long overdue?
Well, clearly that is the Paymaster General's view at that time. Again, she was the minister responsible for this particular subject. I wasn't in charge of the overall government at that point, so it's hard for me to speak to what the overall government's view was at that particular moment, because I was not responsible for it. She was the responsible minister, was closer to what was happening, and clearly that was her view at the time. But again, that was in advance of, I think, the inquiry having made any interim reports before the Paymaster General appointing Robert Francis to do his study. Yes. So none of that had happened at that point. But clearly, for someone who was involved in it, saw that that was the direction of travel. And indeed, was not wrong in the sense that since then, around £500 million of compensation payments have been paid through the financial support schemes.
Yes, I should just say the financial support schemes have never been characterised as compensation, just in terms of...
Yes, but they were the mechanism for delivering...
In terms of the interim payments
delivering
last year.
the interim payments, so those were the mechanism, as I understand
Yes.
it, that was used to deliver the interim compensation payments of £100,000.
So officials on any view within the Treasury would have been aware that the question of compensation was regarded by the minister most closely involved as long overdue and urgent in terms of being addressed. There's no suggestion here in Ms Mordaunt's letter that the question of compensation didn't need to be looked at, for example, until the inquiry reported. It's action now that she's talking about.
Well, that's what she said. I think slightly differently, I believe that in Parliament later on, she did make a statement whilst in that role saying that the issue of compensation would be determined after the inquiry made its final recommendations. That's what she said in Parliament. My understanding is in a statement later. So I think the second part of what you said is slightly different to what she then later said in Parliament.
Well, let's just look at some of the key dates then. We have these correspondence in July and September 2020. And although I'm picking matters up in 2020, Prime Minister, the question of compensation had been there'd been calls for compensation for decades, as reflected, I think, in some of your opening observations. And there'd been calls by parliamentarians, in particular, between 2017 and 2019 for compensation. But in terms of the government, 2020, we have Ms Mordaunt's letters. And then in March 2021, and it may be that this is what you're referring to, Prime Minister, the Paymaster General announced in Parliament that an independent reviewer would be asked to carry out a study looking at options for a framework on compensation, ready to implement upon the conclusion of the inquiry. Was that what you had in mind when you referred to Ms Mordaunt's subsequent statements?
Yes, I believe it was at that time.
So March 2021, she commissions that. In May 2021, a couple of months later, the Secretary of State for Health, the then Secretary of State for Health, I should say, Mr Hancock, gave evidence to this inquiry saying that if the inquiry recommended compensation, the government will pay it. Again, I'm just trying to get the main dates before I come and ask you a couple of questions. March 2022, then, was the delivery by Sir Robert Francis of the compensation framework study to the Cabinet Office. And then if we just pick matters up at the end of March 2022, for the purpose then of the questions I want to ask you, Lawrence, can we have on screen, please, RLIT 302052? Thank you. So we've got the date there, 31st of March 2022. And if we zoom in on the first answer from the Minister for the Cabinet Office, please, Lawrence. So Mr Ellis, who was by this time in post, says, Sir Robert Francis delivered his report to me on the 14th of March. I will carefully consider his findings and recommendations. It is my intention to publish the compensation framework study alongside the government's response as soon as possible and in sufficient time for the infected blood inquiry and its core participants to consider them before Sir Robert gives evidence to the inquiry, which was due to be, and in fact was, in July 2022. Now, you will know, Prime Minister, and I'm not going to ask you about the detail of this, we've explored it with other witnesses, but you will know that the government did not publish its response to the Francis study, either at that time or at any point subsequently. So that's the chronology, March 2022. There is then this inquiry's first interim report and a prompt decision made by government to accept the recommendation within 3 weeks of the interim payments. We then moved to December 2022, when Mr Quinn, the minister who was by that time responsible, accepted the moral case for compensation in Parliament. And we can look at it if need be, but I'm sure you're familiar with that from the reading that you've done for the purposes of your evidence. So he accepted the moral case but couldn't commit to a timetable. And then we have the second interim report of this inquiry in April. And then subsequent parliamentary statements have been to the effect that the government's still not made a decision on the question of compensation. Now that's the core chronology then, raised in the terms we've seen it by Ms Mordaunt in 2020. So over 3 years ago, the matter was identified by Ms Mordaunt as both urgent and long overdue. Over 16 months since Sir Robert Francis's compensation framework study was delivered to the government, and now over 3.5 months since the government's second interim report, recommending compensation on the basis of wrongs done at individual, collective and systemic levels. And the people whose lives were torn apart by those wrongs still have no idea of the shape, the form, the scope of any compensation scheme or of timescale. Now, against that background, that overarching chronology, I'm going to invite, if you're able to, a yes or no answer to this question. Is that good enough in terms of the government's response?
Well, the first thing I'd say is, of course, people have been waiting far too long to get the recognition that they deserve for what's happened and the redress for what's happened. I was very clear about that at the outset of my remarks. Now, I can only speak to the government that I'm responsible for, which, as you highlighted at the beginning, has only been for the last 8 months or so. So many of the things earlier in that chronology, the government might have done, but I'm sure you'll take evidence from other people. Ultimately, that was not my responsibility at the time, so it's not something I was directly involved in or can answer to. What I can tell you is what's happened under my government whilst I've been Prime Minister. And since that's happened, days afterwards, interim payments were made to around 4,500 people, £100,000 each. In December, as you mentioned, that was a couple of months after I was Prime Minister, for the first time ever in decades, first time any government accepted the moral case for compensation. That was an important recommendation. I believe it was the first recommendation put in Robert Francis's study, and the Minister for the Cabinet Office accepted that on the floor of the House of Commons for the first time ever. And that happened whilst I was Prime Minister. And then subsequently to that, and in parallel, there's been an enormous amount of work that is happening across government, which, as the Minister responsible, the Minister for the Cabinet Office, I'm sure, explained when he was giving evidence earlier this week, to ensure that when the government receives the final report, as has been its position consistently, it will aim to act as quickly as possible to make decisions and provide people with the recognition of the justice that they deserve. As I said, the chronology stretches back long before I was Prime Minister, and but as I said, since I have been Prime Minister, these are the very specific steps that have been taken, which I think are meaningful, but I acknowledge, of course, there's more to do, and I'm determined to move as quickly as practically possible after the government receives the final report. But in parallel, an enormous amount of work is going on all the questions around compensation.
I'm going to press you for an answer to the question, Prime Minister. You were not, of course, the Prime Minister from 2020. And I'm not suggesting that if there was fault on the part of government, it's fault for which you have a personal responsibility. But you were one of the most senior members of the government, and you now lead the government. And I'm inviting your perspective, given what you now know, you may not have known it at the time, but given what you now know, over 3 years, and still no concrete compensation framework in sight and no information about that, what it might look like. Is that good enough?
I think what I'd say is, of course, people want to see... All I'd say is, in order for the government to make decisions on compensation, it is rightly has asked an independent inquiry to conclude its work, to provide the advice to government and recommendations about what to do. Now, having not been at the time responsible for initiating this inquiry in 2018, 2017, when it was announced, and determining its terms of reference, it's hard for me to second guess the process that was envisaged at the time or what I would have done differently. But the government at the time, having decided to establish an independent inquiry to make recommendations on compensation, fully funding it, recognising that this was a complex and sensitive issue that required independent and thorough investigation, as is happening, it's reasonable to allow that inquiry to conclude its work. Now, at the time, 2020, 2019, the inquiry had not concluded its work. Estimates had not been provided, questions around scope, eligibility, how best to do it, delivery mechanisms, none of those questions had been answered. Now, of course I appreciate that people want to see action as soon as humanly possible. I can entirely sympathise with that, right? And so sooner the better for sure, right? And of course, this has been going on for decades. Of course that's not good enough. But it's very hard for me to second guess the decisions that were made by people in good faith to establish an independent, thorough investigation of all these issues, provide advice to government on how best to deal with compensation and implement it, and then for government to act after receiving that advice. So in one sense, if the inquiry has taken this amount of time to provide that evidence, then saying to government, you should have acted before receiving the evidence, I think this is tricky. Because ultimately, people would then say, if they didn't like what the government had done, well, why haven't you waited for the result of your independent inquiry to come back and tell you its views on compensation? So if the government had just preemptively acted before the conclusion of this inquiry and reached a conclusion that people were unhappy with, I think most people would have said, well, you set up an independent inquiry. It's right that you should let that inquiry make recommendations to you before deciding what to do. So I think that is an entirely, that process, I don't seem to think is unreasonable one. Now, would it be preferable for that process all to be able to happen faster than it has done? Of course it would be, because this has been going on for far too long. I acknowledged that at the beginning. This has been going on for decades. People have been waiting. But in terms of the process that I did not put in train, that is in train, and I think is reasonable, I think that is right that the inquiry finishes its work, provides those independent recommendations, which it has done and is doing, and then the government acts as quickly as possible to make decisions and bring the appropriate recognition and redress to people.
May I just ask, is your answer then to Councill's question that you would have wished it had been quicker?
Well, I think no one, of course it would wish it would have been quicker, right? Yeah. I think that seems self-evident. This has been going on for decades. I don't think anyone would sit here and say that they wish that this process could not be concluded quickly, given what's happened over the successive decades. Everyone wants to see as swift resolution to this tragedy as possible, this appalling scandal be righted as quickly as possible, but also, as your work has uncovered over the past 5, 6 years, however long you have been investigating this, that there are a range of complicated things to work through, a range of sensitivities. It's important that that work is done thoroughly, so that there's a full and proper understanding of the issues at stake and the appropriate way to provide that recognition and redress. And if it was a simple matter, then presumably no one would have thought an inquiry was the right thing to do, but people called for an inquiry. They called for an inquiry because they thought it was right that someone independently looked at all these issues, and they supported the work of the inquiry, and that work is happening. But as a general principle, would I prefer this all to be dealt with as quickly as possible? Of course, because this is an appalling scandal that has gone on for decades.
Ms Mordaunt, as her contemporaneous statements made clear, as well as her evidence to this inquiry, commissioned the compensation framework study precisely so that the government could have independent advice without waiting for the recommendations of the inquiry, albeit that the structure would then only be set up and the payments made once the inquiry had made its recommendations. But the whole point of Ms Mordaunt's actions in commissioning Sir Robert France's study was that everything could be done to ensure that on the conclusion of the inquiry, not weeks or months after, but on the conclusion of the inquiry, compensation could be payable if that was what the inquiry recommended. Now, over 16 months since Sir Robert reported to the Cabinet Office, those most affected by this still have no idea of the government's response. Is that good enough?
So what Penny Mordaunt said, I believe at the time of the statement, was that government would wait to receive the inquiry's final recommendations before making decisions on compensation. I believe that's what she said at the time that she announced the Robert Francis study. I believe she said that in the House of Commons from the dispatch box. I think that was her stated position. And again, because I was not responsible for this policy or for the government, and nor did Penny Mordaunt report to me, obviously I'm not privy to whatever decisions were made at that time as to what people's thinking in government was about this particular area. But I think she was clear that her expectation was Robert Francis's work would inform the work of the inquiry, but ultimately government would respond when the inquiry had concluded. And I think that's what she said pretty clearly at the time. But it is worth saying that government has acted since then in providing interim compensation payments, which was the recommendation of the interim report. It was acted on swiftly in a matter of weeks, and then shortly after I became Prime Minister, those payments were made to 4,500 people.
What Ms Mordaunt said in Parliament was she was commissioning this work to look at options for a framework ready to implement upon the conclusion of the inquiry. Now, leave aside what she meant by the conclusion of the inquiry, because she probably didn't envisage that the inquiry would make its recommendations on compensation before its final report. Does the government have options that are ready to implement upon the conclusion of the inquiry?
The government, as you would have heard from the Minister for the Cabinet Office this week, is conducting an extensive amount of cross-government work to analyse all the various questions and recommendations posed in the interim reports, so that government is in a position to act as quickly as possible after receiving the final report. And that work continues at pace. Again, the minister responsible is the Minister of the Cabinet Office, and he would have explained in detail exactly what is happening over the past several months that he's had that job. But there is extensive work that is happening. There's a determination to move as quickly as possible, as I said, and at the appropriate time, that advice would be surfaced to me.
I will come back to the phrases as soon as possible or as quickly as possible and at pace, because they're phrases that the inquiry has heard a lot without having a clear idea of what's meant by that. But can I just repeat the question? Does the government have options that are ready, and I'm not asking you for detail of what they are because of the parameters of government decision-making and so on, does it have options ready to implement upon the conclusion of the inquiry?
As you acknowledged earlier, advice would not be brought to my attention until it was ready, because that work is ongoing, and the policy work is complex. All the issues involved that have been highlighted in previous evidence require quite a lot of thought and consideration about how best to do them. Those decisions have not been made, but that policy work is ongoing so that the government is in a position to move quickly. But that work is clearly not concluded and no decisions have been made, and I am not intimately involved or familiar with it, as would be normal, because that would be surfaced to me at the appropriate time.
So is the answer to my question no, or is the answer to my question I don't know?
The answer to your question is I would not be in a position to go over the policy detail at this stage, because it would not have been, as is entirely normal, not been surfaced with me, because the policy development is ongoing.
Just if I may, Mr. Richards, I heard the answer not so much as no, but not yet. There may not be much of a difference. Can I just remind everyone, I know the evidence is emotive to many of you, but we do have a tradition of respecting the witness to make it easier for them to say what they want to say. Please.
Could we look at something you say in your witness statement, Prime Minister? WITN 7712001, paragraph 5, please, Lawrence. So if we go to the next page. You say this at the conclusion of your statement. You set out that the government is taking every step to prepare to respond appropriately to the inquiry's final report. Can I ask what the basis is for your statement to that effect? Is that an assurance you've been given, or is that your own assessment of the position?
Both, I'd say. There is an extensive amount of work ongoing in government on this issue, which the Minister for the Cabinet Office, as I said, would have outlined for everybody here and as done previously, but he's had, I think, half a dozen different meetings with all of those involved across government, having met campaign groups as well, the APPG, having met those directly infected and affected, having engaged with ministers from the devolved administrations. So all of that work is ongoing, and there's a determination to move thoroughly through all the issues that need working through.
What we learnt from Mr. Quinn's evidence is that meetings at permanent secretary level commenced on the 30th of November last year, that the small ministerial group that he asked to establish and was permitted to establish began its meetings in February of this year, that the meetings with devolved administrations took place in June, possibly also July of this year. Now that suggests that there has been work undertaken over the last few months, but doesn't really explain the position over the preceding 2.5 years. Are you able to cast any further light on why we really seem to see only activity over the last few months?
Well, I think you said you started seeing activity in November, and I became Prime Minister at the end of October. So again, I can talk to you in detail about the government that I'm responsible for, and as you say, I became Prime Minister on the 25th of October. That first set of meetings that you described happened in November, and there have been, I believe, half a dozen meetings since then at a ministerial level, which is almost one a month, which is a significant amount of activity for cross-ministerial work, I would say, in my experience, as well as further meetings with APPG chairs and those affected as well. So taken together, I think that is a significant body of work since I became Prime Minister, and that is what I can best speak to and am responsible for. Obviously, I'm not responsible for the preceding 2 to 3 years of how government organised its time. But I'm sure you all have and will take evidence from those who were at the time, and they can probably answer better to that than I can.
The government's position of waiting until it receives the final report is the next matter I wanted to ask you about, Prime Minister. So Mr. Quinn told us in terms that is the government's position, to wait for this inquiry's final report before it responds to the question of compensation. Now, does the government acknowledge and accept that this inquiry's second interim report, so the report published on the 5th of April of this year, constitutes the Chair's complete recommendation on compensation? That is his final report on the question of what compensation should be payable and to whom. Does the government understand that?
Government does understand that, but as is entirely normal and precedented, government would wait for the conclusion of an inquiry's findings, so it has the full context and understanding of everything that is relevant to the situation before making final decisions. That's the long-standing convention and precedent, and what advice we recommend following, and that is the process being undertaken here. Having said that, that doesn't mean that work doesn't begin beforehand, and as we've just been talking about, work has been ongoing for all the months that I've been Prime Minister at a more intensive pace than I think has happened at any point previous to that. So people should be reassured that just because the final report hasn't come does not mean that all the questions that have been raised in the interim report are being looked at, being examined, being analysed and being worked through, because there is the determination to try and move as quickly as practically possible, but it is entirely normal that government would wait for the full context of an inquiry's findings to be concluded.
That may be a perfectly ordinary process in many cases, but here, government has accepted already the moral case for compensation. It's accepted already that the making of some interim payments, and described by the then Prime Minister as, I think, the beginning, not the end. It's said in terms through its then Secretary of State for Health, Mr. Hancock, if the inquiry recommends compensation, the government will pay it. Why in those circumstances, and given everything you've recognised about the decades of suffering and the decades of being rebuffed, why wait further? What is it you think you will learn, and when I say you, I mean the government, will learn from the final report relevant to the question of compensation that you do not already know?
Because before making final decisions, there's the context in which those decisions need to be made. So understanding the full context of the inquiry's findings about what has happened over the preceding decades is important for a variety of policy reasons, as I understand it, that will have a bearing on various things. And that's why the government would ordinarily wait to have the final report, so it has a full set of findings to make decisions on. There's good legal precedent and reasons for that, and rational decision-making would suggest that is the right thing to do. But I would go back to saying that that doesn't stop the government from acting, and it has acted. The payment, I think, as you acknowledged, the payment of interim compensation payments to 4,500 people is a significant step. It was described as such by Robert Francis, and where I think he described those sums as, in his words, significant amounts, because he recognised at the time that it was likely that ultimate compensation would take time. I believe the first interim report from this inquiry also acknowledged very clearly that it was likely that the government would normally wait until receiving the final report before making decisions, and acknowledge that itself. So that was, as I said, a recommendation in the interim. This inquiry recognised that that is what the likely, I think, scenario would be. So I don't think that's untoward, but the government is acting with interim compensation payments, and acting, as you said, to be the first government ever in decades to accept the moral case for compensation. Now, of course, that is only a step towards providing the recognition and redress that everyone here and everyone watching deserves, but it should give people some comfort about my and the government's determination to sort this out and address it, given we are taking steps that no other government has taken.
What are the sound policy reasons you referred to in your answer a few minutes ago for waiting for the final report in this context?
I think as the inquiry acknowledged in its note of the 21st, whilst ongoing policy making is happening, it is difficult for me to comment in detail on those things, and indeed that was something that the inquiry acknowledged in its note on the 21st of July, and indeed something the Minister of the Cabinet Office would have spoken to as well. As I said, in general terms, I can talk about it, which is that it is important for rational decision-making purposes, legally if nothing else, to have the full findings of an inquiry before making decisions. That is absolutely precedented in normal advice, and understanding the full context of all the inquiry's findings before making final decisions on something as complex and sensitive as this.
And what, I may be repeating a question, but what is it that the government thinks it will know relevant to compensation that it doesn't already know?
Again, I know this will sound frustrating, but because there are active policies under consideration and legal considerations which ordinarily the government would not comment on, whilst those decisions are yet to be made, I can't go into those things in detail, but it is entirely normal and would be normally legally advised to the government not to make final decisions until an inquiry has finished. And there are a variety of things that the inquiry may or may not say in its final report that will impact the overall way that this appalling scandal is treated and dealt with, and it will put the previous findings in a broader context that is helpful for the government when it makes those final decisions.
One of the recommendations in the interim report, the second interim report of the inquiry, expressed, as you know, to be the final word on compensation, is that the compensation scheme should be set up now and should begin its work before the end of the year. I think that's recommendation 18 from memory. Does your evidence mean that the government has rejected recommendation 18?
The government is doing its work, and what I don't want to do is add to what I believe to be a litany of broken promises and dashed expectations that everyone in this room and everyone watching has had to endure for years, if not decades. So the last thing I want to do is sit here and promise something else and give people false hope, and I want to be completely straight. Right? I want to see resolution as quickly as practically possible. I've made that crystal clear. The actions of my government to date should give people some confidence and assurance that that is what we are working towards. But these are sensitive, complicated matters on a significant scale that require work to work through them properly. That work is happening, so it's hard for me to give a precise time frame on exactly when and how these things will be resolved. But an important step on that is receiving the final report, obviously.
Some fear that the reason, or a reason, why the government's position, and I don't think this is active ongoing policy making, it's been the government's position as I understand it for some time, unmovable, of waiting for the final report before it makes any decisions on compensation, is either an excuse for delay because the government only started the real work too late, or it's because at that point, the point of delivery of the final report, the inquiry will no longer have powers and the government will be free to ignore the recommendations of the inquiry with impunity. That's the fear, Mr. Sunak. I'm not putting that to you as a statement of fact, but that is people's concern. And the absence of a clear explanation as to why government is waiting for the final report when that wasn't what the second interim report anticipated is fueling that fear. Are there any observations you can make in relation to those matters?
Well, the reassurance I try and give people is to say, look how we've acted, to be the first government that accepted the moral case for compensation, to have made the interim compensation payments. Now that the MCO has given evidence, people can see a sense of the breadth and intensity of the work that is happening in government that, as far as I can tell, was not there in the past. So I think that should give people some reassurance that there's a desire to see this through. And in terms of things like this happening, I think it's entirely normal that inquiries would finish their work, make recommendations to the government, and then government would respond appropriately to them. That's what happens in every other case. That is exactly normal. And then it's a question of, well, how is government held to account? I think we're very lucky to live in a country where there is very strong parliamentary scrutiny. We have a very vibrant media, as the chair alluded to at the beginning. So there's lots of different ways that government is held to account, both in Parliament and in public opinion, for how it behaves, and is very transparent about all of those things. But I think it's entirely normal that inquiries finish their work, make recommendations, government will respond, and the combination of public opinion and Parliament rightly holds government to account, and we have very strong scrutiny accountability mechanisms to do that.
Do you accept that waiting for the final report inevitably means further delay, and depending on how long the government then takes to consider the report, may then lead into a period of a general election, of election purdah with all the policy-making constraints that imposes? And so this could simply prolong the question of compensation for a very substantial period of time indeed, which was certainly not, I think, what Ms. Mordaunt anticipated.
I think, as the chair set out at some point when he was describing this inquiry's work, I think the chair said wanted to proceed as quickly as thoroughness allows. I think that is a good guide to how government should behave as well. And that's certainly my intention, is to proceed as quickly as thoroughness allows, as this inquiry's work is also doing. And that's the commitment that I would give people. And as I said, the track record since I've been Prime Minister has showed I think, considerable forward progress, accepting that there is still lots to do.
Will you, Prime Minister, can I stress in asking this question, I'm not asking you to perform a volte-face on the government's position in the witness box. Okay, that would not be a correct question to put to you. But will you, Prime Minister, agree to the government looking again, to you and your colleagues, looking again at the question of whether you really should wait until the final report rather than take decisions and announce decisions now, given everything you've referred to about people suffering, about the period of time, about people dying whilst they're waiting? Would you agree to go and look at that again? I'm not asking you to commit to any outcome, because that would have to be a matter then for collective decision-making within government. But is that something you can take back? Not least because if the principal reason for waiting for the final report is that that's what normally happens, that may not be a good enough reason.
I think it's right that government goes through this properly, given the complexity and scale of the scandal that has befallen us over many decades. And this inquiry's work has taken several years, rightly and necessarily. So I think that gives everyone a sense of the complexity and scale of what we're dealing with, that this inquiry's work has taken that long. And it was right that it takes that long, because there's a lot to go through, and these are important issues that require thorough examination. And I think it's equally right that government is thorough in how it then responds. Now, I don't want, as I said before, I don't want to add to the history of false promises, dashed hopes and expectations. The actions of the government to date speak to my desire to move this forward, and that remains my commitment. The actions demonstrate that, and the work is ongoing to enable us to do that, and it will continue to do so. Everyone in government, from me down, understands the urgency and importance of this issue, and I'm sure these hearings and your work have only reminded everybody of the importance and urgency of it, and I know that will be an important feature of the work going forward too.
So is the answer to my question that you're not able to give one, or that you're declining to...
No, I think, Ms. Richards, as you said, it wouldn't be appropriate for me to change government policy here at the dispatch box.
You're talking over each other. Could you let the Prime Minister finish his answer before we ask the next question?
Yeah. No, I'd say it wouldn't be appropriate for me to speculate on changing government policy here, as you acknowledged. As I said, I've given you an answer fulsome in my desire to see urgency around this issue, and I think these hearings have served to remind everybody working on this issue in government how important it is that we move with urgency, because of the appalling scandal that this was and the decades of injustice that have brought us to this point.
My question, Prime Minister, was not would you change the government's position in the witness box, but is there any willingness on the part of the government you lead to look again at the question of waiting for the final report?
Again, Ms. Richards, it wouldn't be appropriate for me to speculate on changing the government's position in public. That wouldn't ordinarily happen, as I think you acknowledged to me in your note on the 21st of July.
May I just ask a question? And I wonder if you can give this your personal consideration, not here, but in due course. It may be thought that waiting for an event, in this case, the publication of the final report, is a question of timing. That is, if it's going to happen then, we can wait till then. And that's when we will take action. It may be a question of principle, which is normally done, that there is a principle of some sort, which means that you need to look at a final report before you answer. But can I ask you just to consider this? I don't want to tempt Providence, but suppose something happened which meant that the inquiry report was inevitably delayed. Suppose, as I said, I don't want to tempt Providence, but suppose some accident happened to me, or some illness which meant that I couldn't complete it for a further 3 months. Are people going to be expected to wait for that further 3 months before having a response from the government, given that they will have all that time until the autumn this year, already passed, in order to get ready to respond?
Well, I'd say, Chair, not wanting to speculate on your future
it's
health
for you to
circumstances,
take back and think about.
No, again, I'd just go back to what I said previously. Ultimately, it's in the inquiry's control when it concludes its inquiry and presents those final findings to government. And I think there's a determination amongst everyone's part to see that happen as quickly as possible. And I'm sure the inquiry will reflect on that as well. That's not what I'm in control of. But what I can control is the work that is ongoing now to make sure that all the things that need to be considered when it comes to compensation, which have been raised in the interim reports, are being looked at and examined, and that policy work is happening. But what I don't want to do, as I said, is put an artificial timeline on something that can't be met. And as I said previously, because I'm not intimately involved in the policy detail, as is entirely normal, as that is surfaced to me, then it will be a different story. But that work is ongoing.
In what was the most recent debate in the House on this issue, which was the 22nd of June 2023, Dame Diana Johnson, at the conclusion of the debate, said this: it seems to me that real political leadership to get this done is lacking. It's not good enough. Action is needed now. And we've seen, and I don't think it's necessary to put it on screen, but we've seen, for example, from the statement of Kit Malthouse, who was then Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, talking about needing to have senior ministerial assistants to push matters through. We've heard from Mr. Hunt, now Chancellor of the Exchequer, but when he gave evidence to this inquiry last year, about the importance of having the Prime Minister's direct involvement in something, and how once the Prime Minister says something can be done, it can be done. He was talking there in the context of the establishment of this inquiry. Ms. Mordaunt said towards the conclusion of her evidence on Monday that she believed this matter to be a priority for the Prime Minister, for you. We know from your statement and understand that it's not hitherto been something in which you've had direct involvement. Is it right to understand that this is now something that you regard as a priority?
Yes, of course. And that's why, as I said, that's why I'm here, and that's why, since the government that I lead was formed, you've seen, I would believe, tangible, concrete progress and action on this very important issue, more so than we've seen in the past, and that's what you will see going forward.
So I understand there are some technical problems with the document display, and I do need to, for the purpose of my next questions, show the Prime Minister some documents he's already seen, but I do need to bring them up on screen. I don't know how long. Told 5 minutes or so.
Well, shall we have an afternoon break at this stage, or is that too early?
It's a matter for you, sir.
Well, I'm conscious that we don't want to detain the Prime Minister any longer than necessary.
No, but I'd say I've got not less than 20 minutes, probably half an hour. Very
well. Well, we'll take a short break. Shall we say, because everyone has to, let's take a quarter of an hour now, shall we? That gives us time to get everything sorted and have the Prime Minister back. Prime Minister, you maybe, this is your time, I think, to leave. As you heard me say at the beginning, everyone will remain in their seats while you exit this chamber. And we will see you back, please, at 3:20.
And the usual warning, sir.
Yes, you're giving evidence. You may not discuss the evidence you have given or anything which you think you may yet be asked in evidence with anyone, whoever that anyone is. See you back at 3:20. can I just mention that it's been mentioned to me during the break that I should remind anyone who wants to use their services that the Red Cross are here and available should anyone need their help.
So
Yes.
I understand the technical problems have been resolved, but before I ask you to look at the document, Prime Minister, I just want to go back to what I was asking you just before the break about the question of priorities. Ms Mordaunt, in her capacity as Leader of the House, when she gave evidence to the inquiry on Monday, said this: "We're about to go into the fourth and final session of legislation. I know that's going to be a short session and there are carryover bills. Whilst there are policy areas still to be resolved and not questions that I can answer on that, but what I can tell you is that in terms of this government and this Prime Minister's priorities going into that fourth session, this is one of his priorities." Now, the Leader of the House has responsibilities, we understand it, for planning and supervising the government's legislative programme, amongst other things.
Yes, that is one of their priorities and responsibilities, yes.
And from your knowledge of the government's legislative programme and plans, was Ms Mordaunt right to say that this was is one of your priorities?
Yes, as I said before, I hope people can take away from the actions of the government since I've been Prime Minister that we are making progress in resolving the years of injustice on this issue and bringing people the redress and recognition that they rightly deserve. And it will continue to be a priority, and that will continue to be a focus for me and the government.
Now, I want to turn to the specific question of interim payments. Can I ask you to look at JEVA 40258? This is a Sunday Times article from the 31st of July 2022. So it's, I think, at the time of the Conservative Party leadership contest, and it refers to the then two Tory leadership hopefuls, Ms Truss and yourself, and says that you had both called for interim payments to be made to the victims of one of the worst disasters in NHS history. I won't read what Ms Truss said, but then what you're recorded as saying is this: "The contaminated blood scandal is a tragic injustice, and we must now match words with action, just as we did with those affected by the thalidomide scandal. Survivors and their families need to have certainty now, so I'd ensure the interim compensation payments recommended by Sir Brian Langstaff are paid without delay." Now, just so that we understand the reference to the thalidomide scandal, am I right in understanding that to be a reference to an announcement you made in March 2021, when as Chancellor you pledged lifetime funding, funding that had otherwise been due to run out this year, saying that the thalidomide victims deserve better than to have constant uncertainty? Is that what that refers to?
I believe so.
And then the reference to matching words with action and the need for survivors and their families to have certainty now. Would you stand by those words today?
Yeah, well, they referred very specifically, so it's important not to take them out of context. They referred very specifically to the recommendations that were made in the interim report about interim compensation payments of £100,000 paid to those who were already part of the support schemes, and indeed that was delivered in full, as I said, days after I became Prime Minister.
Yes, it was announced, I think, by the then Prime Minister on the 17th of August.
Yes.
So within 3 weeks of the first interim report recommendation on interim payments, the government took a decision and acted. Now, you will know, I'm sure, that amongst the other recommendations in the inquiry's second interim report is a recommendation for interim payments to be made to a cohort of individuals who did not receive the interim payments made last year. So the interim payments made last year were in relation to survivors, those who were infected who still live, and to bereaved partners and widows. Those whose children died, those whose parents died, have never benefited from the financial support schemes and never received any compensation. And they are the focus of one of the Chair's recommendations, and a recommendation for interim payments now. If we look at JEVA 40276, please, just to provide some further context to this issue. This is a letter sent by, I think, some campaigners to you at the beginning of this week. I don't know whether it reached you through your ordinary offices, but I know the inquiry has forwarded it on to you. We could just go further down the page, please, Lawrence. Yes, so I just want to pick it up with the paragraph beginning our journey. Our journey has been marked by immeasurable pain and loss. Sir Brian Langstaff's done commendable work in putting forth recommendations that offer a fair resolution. However, these recommendations still need to be fulfilled, our pleas echoing in what seems to be an empty hall. The appointment of the ALB's chair remains to be made. This delay denies victims and their families any tangible sense of progress. Many continue to die without seeing full redress. This cannot be right. And then it's the next issue that I want to explore with you, Prime Minister. The interim payment for deaths not yet recognised is critical. These payments are not just about compensation. They symbolise acknowledgement, and they represent initial recognition of each life lost. We know, for example, that many of the 380 children infected with HIV died in childhood, and their deaths remain unrecognised. Now, before I ask you, and I'm sorry, this is a long introduction to a question, but before I ask you the question, I'm going to ask you to look at something in the Chair's second interim report about the position of children whose parents died and parents whose children died. So if we could have, please, Lawrence, INQY 40453, and if we could go, please, to page 7, I think. I'm going to pick it up at the bottom of the page, the last paragraph, and then over to the next page. Colin was around a year old when he was given factor concentrate. At about 2.5, he was diagnosed with HIV. His parents, Colin and Janet Smith, gave evidence to the inquiry. His mother said he loved school, but he became too ill to go, really. I mean, sometimes he'd just say, I think I want to go to school today, and we'd put him in a wheelchair, wrap him up, and we'd get him literally to the door, and then he'd say, I want to go home now. His father recalled, I lost my job because the boss was scared of people finding out and losing customers. So within a week, I got another job. I thought, if we can go over the page, I thought I'd take a night shift job. Nobody around, nobody would know me, but the day I was going to start, he called me into the office and said he couldn't start me. So from that point on, I was basically unemployable. I went to the job centre, they wouldn't let me sign on. Colin died aged 7. His father said there's no way a child should have to die the way he did. It wasn't pleasant. It still affects us now. And it's not just our son, there's lots of children who've had to go through that. I could cope with death, but not with the death of my son. I still have trouble today, the fact that he's in a grave on his own and the guilt will never go away. And then just one further passage, if I may, Prime Minister. It's the next one. Susan. Susan's 2 sons, I should say, were infected with HIV and died in childhood of AIDS. Susan, mother of Brian and Stephen, gave evidence to the inquiry. You think what might have been. I can only still see them as 9 and 16. But it's Christmas. A couple of weeks ago, it was Brian's birthday, but Christmas we put flowers on. And right after Christmas, it's Stephen's birthday. In the February, so more flowers. Then in May, it's Brian's anniversary. Then in September, it's Brian's birthday. And then in October, it's Stephen's anniversary. And pausing there, the anniversary she refers to is the anniversary of their deaths. And then we're back to Christmas again. And it doesn't matter how many years go by, you're still asking why. And I keep going to the grave and I keep saying, sometimes I think they're not there, they're going to walk in. I just think, no, it can't be. Why? I just want someone to tell me why. It won't bring them back. I just want them back so much. I just ache for them to come back. You can't get on with your life. I just ache. I think it's like a heartache. Your heart is aching so much. Your whole body aches. I'm just mentally and physically tired, I think. I just want them back and I can't. Now, those are just 2 examples, Prime Minister, as I'm sure you understand, of the groups of individuals whose deaths have and whose continuing suffering have never been measured or recognised through financial support or compensation. And they are some of those whose suffering would be recognised if interim payments were made. As you've told us, it took only a short period of time for the first lot of interim payments to be made. But nearly 4 months down the line from the recommendation in relation to interim payments to people who've never received anything, there is still no action on the part of the government. Is there any good reason, having regard to what you said last summer in relation to the first lot of interim payments, is there any good reason for the government delaying in taking a decision on the question of interim payments for these people?
I think the first thing I'd say is I have 2 young children, and I can't imagine the loss that Brian and Stephen's mother felt and Colin's parents felt, and as you said, there's hundreds more like that from everything we know, each one a tragedy for every one of those families, and it's heartbreaking to read it again and listen to it again as I've done previously. And they are absolutely uppermost in mine and everyone else's thoughts. With regard to what might happen in terms of future compensation, obviously that is one of the many recommendations in the report, and that is subject to ongoing government decision-making and policy-making, which is why it's difficult for me to speculate further or go into more detail about what may or may not happen in that regard. But of course that work is ongoing. Questions of scope are important. There are significant questions that need to be answered as part of resolving this overall scandal and how best to do it. But because it relates to decisions that haven't been yet made, obviously there's not much more I can add to that.
Would you agree that the longer it's going to take for the government to reach conclusions about a compensation scheme overall, whether that's waiting for the final report, putting through primary legislation, appointing people, whatever it might be, the longer it's going to take, the greater importance there may be to the government considering further interim payments for those who've never received them, or indeed further interim payments for those who have. Is that something that government understands, that there's a relationship between how long you're going to take to set everything up and perhaps taking some interim measures now?
Yeah, again, Ms. Richards, for all the reasons that I've outlined, because all these matters are subject to ongoing government policy making and deliberation where final decisions haven't been made, I can't, and it wouldn't be appropriate to comment or speculate on what may or may not happen in the active considerations of government. But as I said, many people have been affected by this scandal over many decades, and an important part of resolving the scandal that is contaminated blood will be working through those issues of scope and eligibility. But as we've seen from the different reports that have been done, indeed there are some points of divergence on that particular question between people who have looked at this, the inquiry's first interim report and Robert Francis' report. It's important that those things are worked through because they obviously are particularly important.
I won't press you further on this question of interim payments for now, but would just leave with a similar invitation to the invitation I made in relation to the position of waiting for a final report. An invitation, which I leave without asking you to commit to it, for the government to think hard about the position of interim payments, particularly if through its own work that it can't tell us about, any final compensation scheme is still some way off in the future. I'm going to turn next as a topic to the question of transparency and openness. Now, you referred, Prime Minister, in some of your early remarks to part of the background events in question. So you will know that those who were infected were, for the most part, not told of the risks of their treatment. You will know that many were not told that they had been infected. You will know that when they turned to the government and elsewhere for answers, they were told for years they'd had the best available treatment, they were rebuffed. Phrases such as bad luck have been used. They feel as though they've been kept in the dark for years about what happened. And as a result, as I'm sure you'll appreciate, trust in government is fragile on the part of those infected and affected. And they feel they are still being kept in the dark because of not knowing what's going to happen in relation to compensation. And that in itself is a further source of distress and anger and trauma. Is that something that the government understands and has at the forefront of its collective mind when taking its decisions? That the fact that people still have no idea about what's going to happen in itself is capable of causing further harm?
I think, as I said right at the outset, people have been waiting for answers not just for months, not just for years, but for decades. And I talked about the layers of injustice because there really have been layers of it, not just the fact that this happened to someone, but the fact that it impacted their family, the fact that they were lied to for so many years about what had happened, and told everything was fine, nothing to see here, when that clearly wasn't the case. And then when they sought answers, sought an inquiry, they were rebuffed for many years until the inquiry was established. And as I acknowledged, this hurt and the suffering isn't just historic, it is continuing today. I acknowledge and understand all of that and sympathise with it.
Mr. Quinn told the House in December 2022, and I think again this year, that he hoped to ensure that those infected and affected were kept fully apprised of the progress that was being made. Now that hasn't happened. If it had, it maybe this hearing wouldn't have been necessary. So those infected and affected have not been given anything other than the information we have about progress being made, working at pace, hoping to achieve things as quickly as possible. I'm not again asking for details of government policy here, Mr. Sunak, but has the government considered, to your knowledge, whether, even if it can't give full details of what it's thinking about at this stage, whether there are any commitments in principle, for example, it could give, so that if there are things still to be worked out, it can give some reassurances publicly to those infected and affected, rather than saving it all up for one announcement at the end?
I think I'll point you back to what I said earlier about the right and proper way to deal with this is to work through the issues thoroughly, which is happening already in government, as the MCO has explained in detail when he was here and in his evidence, and the track record of the government under my leadership to make significant progress on these issues, both with the interim payments and the acceptance of the moral case for compensation and the work that has been done. And again, as soon as government receives a final report, that will help move the process forward even further.
Would you agree that it wouldn't be acceptable for those infected and affected to find out any information about the government's decision-making from the media, rather than directly from the government?
I mean, I think in general, the Minister for Cabinet Office has been in Parliament, which would be ordinarily the right place to do this, and for the government to be held accountable, where I think he's made at least 2 different statements and participated in at least one debate as on top of the various meetings he's had, including one at least, I believe, with various people involved in the APPG on this particular issue, as well as having met with those chairs. So those are all the various channels of normal parliamentary scrutiny of the government, which I think are functioning and working well, and there's many different ways for people to hold their members of parliament to account, and indeed the government in all the appropriate ways that we have in this country.
Yes, Prime Minister, my question was not suggesting that there's any impropriety in announcements being made in Parliament at all. My question was about the media. Can we look at RLIT 0002137, please? So this is an article in the Financial Times. Can we zoom in on the... Thank you, Lawrence. So you will see there's reference in the first paragraph, I'm looking at the left-hand column, to a suggestion that a compensation bill could reach 10 billion, according to officials, in a further blow to the UK's stretched public finances. Then there's reference to the acceptance of the moral case. And then fourth paragraph, government officials have told the Financial Times that the compensation scheme might cost 5 billion to 10 billion pounds. There's then reference to the tight nature of public finances, to discussions between Treasury officials and Department of Health officials. We're working through the options, said one government insider. Another official added, people are very worried about the cost. So that's one article, and then there's a second article, if we can just look at it, RLIT 0002136. It's to similar effect, except now the figure that's given is quadruple or double, depending which end of the scale you take, than the previous article. There's reference to ministers, this is the second paragraph in the left-hand column, examining financial modelling, which places the upper forecast for total compensation to those infected with HIV and hepatitis C and their loved ones at the mid-20 billions. There's reference to concern in Whitehall, to ministers not knowing where the money is coming from, with the compensation at present completely unfunded, the Telegraph has been told. Now, those articles contain information that hadn't been shared with Parliament, hadn't, most importantly for these purposes, been shared with those infected and affected. There may be three possibilities that occur to me in relation to how these articles came to contain this information. Leaks from civil servants without ministerial knowledge, approval or encouragement within one or more government department. Leaks with ministerial knowledge, government or encouragement within one or more government departments, or the journalists simply making it up. Do you know if there has been any investigation within government to establish which of those three it is, or whether there is any other explanation?
I don't, to my knowledge, I'm not sure of any particular investigation that has happened on that particular issue, but as I think everyone would probably understand, much as I would love to be able to control whether anyone leaking information from government, that is not something that I can do. We do on occasion initiate leak investigations, but it's very hard, as people know, to ultimately track down sources of leaks from government. But my general view is, of course, people shouldn't leak from government. I would certainly not authorise any of that, didn't authorise any of that. And as I said, if it was possible to know who would do it, then of course I would take action. But
well, my question to you, next question is, should there be an investigation? And can I explain why I put that question to you, Prime Minister? Because it might be said that if this was consciously being leaked by government, whether it's civil servants or ministers or both, it might suggest a strategy on the part of government to try and get the public and media on its side, or on the side of government inaction or rejection of some of the recommendations. And that would be wholly wrong. I'm sure you would agree if that were the position. I'm not suggesting to you it is. We just don't know. Do you now think, looking at that there should be an investigation?
Again, it's not something I would speculate or comment on how the government conducts leak inquiries, because they're necessarily sensitive, and the last thing you would do is tell people you're about to do so. But as I said, there's an established set of procedures in place that we have.
I'm going to just end with a few more general questions, Prime Minister. And I want to take you first of all to a passage which I think I asked Ms Mordaunt about as well. It's RLIT 302074. This is Parliament, 25th of April 2017, and it's Andy Burnham giving, I think, his last speech in Parliament and choosing to do it on the subject of infected blood. if we could go a little further down the page, please, Lawrence. If I can find the right passage. Yes. The second paragraph, it's the end of that, where Mr. Burnham talks about there having been goodwill on both sides of the House, a sense that people wanted to do something to help. That continued in the early part of this Parliament with a sense building that something was going to be done. However, following those expectations, victims now feel that they've been led up to the top of the hill only to be let down once again. And then if we go to the very bottom of the page, please, Lawrence. No, I can't find the reference I had in mind. It's a reference in any event to government's failure to back what had been Mr. Cameron's apology with substantial action having left people feeling in the wilderness all over again.
It's the paragraph message.
Oh, I'm grateful both to you, sir, and to Lawrence for finding that. So Mr. Burnham went on to call for the payment of compensation now, later on in the debate, as I'm sure you know. Now that's over 6 years ago. Do you understand, Prime Minister, does the government understand that with all these years having gone by and 16 months having elapsed since Sir Robert delivered his study to the government, that many victims of the infected blood disaster feel, as Mr. Burnham described them there, that they've been led up to the top of the hill only to be let down again, that they feel in the wilderness all over again because of the lack of any announcement or action on the issue of compensation?
Well, I think subsequent to that, the former Prime Minister did do something that people had been calling for many, many years, if not decades, which was a public inquiry. And that was established, I believe, after that debate happened, something that was a huge source of, rightly, a source of grievance for people, because they wanted answers, they wanted them thoroughly investigated, they didn't have confidence in, particularly the Department for Health, to do it, and they had been rebuffed for years, if not decades. Many people in this room, I'm sure, were part of those calling for an inquiry. That inquiry was established. It was announced, I think, the same year as that debate, probably relatively shortly thereafter. It started its work months after that, and obviously that inquiry's work is still ongoing. And during that period, interim payments have most recently been made, and the moral case for compensation has been accepted. So compared to when those statements were made, clearly there has been progress. Is there more to do? Absolutely, I recognise that. But given one of the, as far as I understand it at the time, very significant demands of people, rightly, were for there to be independent inquiry established to examine this issue of compensation and everything else. That has been done. Now, the inquiry's work has perhaps taken longer than people anticipated or expected, but it's right that that work is done thoroughly, and that is ongoing. And as I said, the interim report that recommended interim compensation payments has been acted on swiftly since then, and the moral case for compensation has been accepted. Again, I'm not well placed to say, because at that period of time, this is not something that I would have had intimate knowledge of, but those are significant developments since that debate happened.
Obviously, things have been done. You've recognised that that doesn't mean that there aren't still very important things that have been currently left unaddressed. Are you able to give any reassurance about timescales? Because we have had reference certainly since March 2022 or thereabouts to working at pace. But that doesn't tell us what the pace is. We have had the phrase "as soon as possible" referred to, with Mr. Ellis, the then Paymaster General, telling Parliament in mid-2020 that the government's response would be published as soon as possible. Those are words, mantras potentially, that don't necessarily have much content unless you can be more specific. So is there any reassurance you can give to those listening about timescales?
I think what guides me is, as we had this conversation earlier, I think the chair's description of when he was describing the work of this inquiry was to move as quickly as thoroughness allowed. I think that is a descriptor for how this inquiry has done its work, and I actually think that is the right phrase.
I think I use the phrase reasonable thoroughness, because you could be too thorough.
I think the point is well made and similar, but I think that is a good guide, not just for this inquiry's work, but for how government should behave, given the scale and complexity and significance of this issue. And as I said, the inquiry has, the fact that this issue is one that is of such a magnitude and complexity and impact to so many people has taken the inquiry this number of years to get to this point, I think demonstrates all the things that I just said. And my commitment is that government will act in the same way, to act as quickly as thoroughness allows. And what I don't want to do is add, as I've said, to the years, if not decades, of dashed and false hope and dashed expectations by putting an arbitrary timescale on something. But I'd rather be honest with people that what is guiding me is the same principle that guides the chair in his work for this inquiry.
To clarify, I'm certainly not asking for an arbitrary timetable. Mr. Quinn told us that there had been an internal deadline, and we've seen it from documents, which was of May of this year, for the work to be completed on our compensation framework. That obviously was not met. Are there internal deadlines? I'm not asking what they are for current purposes, but are there, as a matter of fact, internal deadlines to which the government is working?
I don't believe that there is a specific month, date, deadline, because people are working, as I said, as quickly as possible through all the various issues to find resolution on them in preparation for the inquiry's final report to be made.
Ms. Mordaunt told the House earlier this year, not long ago I think, this. She said, "It may fall to us in this place on our shift to put that right, but we must put it right. There is not just the original injustice that was done to these people, many of whom were children at the time, but the further layers of injustice that have happened with regard to their financial resilience, as many of them lost their homes and were not able to work, facing the appalling stigma and hardship that came with that. We have to put that right." Would you accept, as Prime Minister, as leader of the current government, that if the acknowledgement of a moral case for compensation is not followed by action in providing compensation, then you are not putting it right?
Of course, action will be taken. That's why considerable work is being done, and that's why the government under my leadership accepted the moral case for compensation and started intensive work to make sure it was in a position to act on those words.
And are you able to tell us unequivocally that this government, your government, is committed to the payment of compensation to those infected and affected, even if you cannot yet tell us the form and scope of the scheme?
Again, of course that's the case, demonstrated by the fact that the government, under my leadership, honoured the interim compensation payments that have been agreed previously, made sure they were paid in a matter of days, and has continued to do extensive work, as the Minister for the Cabinet Office evidence will have demonstrated to people. That's not the work of a government that isn't committed to acting on this issue.
Mr. Hancock, having told the inquiry in his capacity as a government minister that if the inquiry recommended compensation, the government would pay compensation, can those listening take it that this government is not intending to renege on that commitment?
Again, because no final decisions have been made, factually that remains the case. As a just matter of constitutional principle, no final decisions have been made on compensation. So that's a statement of fact. You know, is my view that compensation is likely to be paid? Of course that's my view, and that's why we accepted the moral case for compensation. That's why the work is ongoing in government to think through all the questions about how and who and when and all those things that were raised in the interim report. But as a matter of fact, obviously that final decision has not been made.
A number of those infected and affected fear that through the length of time that has taken so far, the absence of any information about what the government might be planning, the decision to await the final report, the inability to give a timescale, they fear that this is something which is going to be kicked off into the long grass and potentially then lost in the complexities of a general election. And I'm just going to, if I may, Prime Minister, just read a couple of statements, observations made by core participants in advance of this hearing. One core participant said this: "What's the use? I could be dead soon and never see my compensation. They're just hanging it out for us all to die and they won't have to pay. Sorry, it's how I feel at the moment." And then another: "All I would say, as we all know, we've waited long enough for this to be settled. Surely even the government must agree that over 40 years is more than enough in anyone's mind. The longer the government drag this on, the more individuals are dying and suffering, and we've suffered more than enough." Now, I just give those as examples to show the strength of fear and concern about this getting kicked off into the long grass, with people continuing to die, people continuing to struggle financially and emotionally. Is there anything else that you feel able to say, Prime Minister, that would provide any form of reassurance to enable those listening to regain confidence that justice will be done without undue delay?
Yes, the reassurance I hope people would take is that, as the comments you mentioned talked about, decades of waiting. Decades and decades of waiting for action, for recognition. And since I've been Prime Minister, which is just 8 and a bit months, we have seen interim compensation payments made to 4,500 people, a significant sum of £100,000. We have seen the moral case for compensation accepted for the first time in those 30 or 40 years, and we have seen, I think, a level of intensity of work on all the questions surrounding compensation that has not happened before, as far as I'm aware, in government, although no doubt your other evidence will demonstrate that. So that is the reassurance that I hope people will take away. Yes, I completely understand. People have been waiting for a long time. People are waiting for redress, waiting for recognition. That's entirely right and reasonable that they are, and they want it to happen as soon as possible. I share those sympathies. I also want to see that, and I'm determined to work as quickly as thoroughness allows to find resolution on all these issues. And the actions of my government over the last 8 months in the context of those 40 years should show people that we are making progress towards that goal.
So those are the questions I'm proposing to ask the Prime Minister, but obviously we will need to take a break. I'm sorry it's taken rather longer, particularly with the technical break. We will need to take a break to allow core participants to suggest any further questions arising out of the oral evidence that they would wish me to consider.
Now, how long a break do you think we might need?
Well, 20 minutes minimum, 20 minutes to 30 minutes.
Shall we say half an hour? I hope that's not inconveniencing you too much, Prime Minister, but we'll come back, shall we, at 25 to 5. If there's any further delay on that, it'll be for good reason and you'll be told. And I can't promise you how long you'll be detained once we come back. It all depends upon the questions that are asked and the answers and so on. But for the moment, if everyone just remains in their seat, you can leave us and come back at 25 to 5. Thank you.
Prime Minister, just a handful of further questions, and as you'll appreciate from our processes, these are questions I've specifically been asked on behalf of call participants to ask you. The first is a matter of detail. When the compensation study from Sir Robert Francis was provided to government, which was in March 2022, you were still Chancellor at that stage. Do you know whether, as a matter of fact, your department did any work to cost it?
I'm not aware, to the best of my recollection.
But that's an issue which presumably somebody within your department would be able to assist us with answering. So somebody within the Treasury, no longer your department.
I would imagine, but as I said, it was not something that I directly am aware of.
Second question is this. You said in the course of your evidence these words, ultimately it's in the inquiry's control when it reports, and then you referred to the government proposing to respond to the inquiry's final report for the purposes of compensation. And these are the questions I'm asked to ask you in relation to that. First, I'm going to say both of them because you may want to answer them together. First, is the government using the inquiry's timeline for reporting as an excuse not to provide compensation for victims? And relatedly, does the government not wish to compensate victims based on the evidence it must already be aware of, which has been publicly given to this inquiry and which you have admitted was an appalling scandal?
I'm happy to provide reassurance. Of course, it's not an excuse, and obviously we had an extensive dialogue about how government typically would wait for an inquiry to conclude all their findings, present all those to government so that it has all the information it needs to make final decisions. And as we've discussed, that work is ongoing in advance of the final report coming, so it's in no way excuse, but it is a step that is required. And the second question is, again, I think related, there is no desire not to do this and take this forward. Obviously, a final decision on compensation has not been made, as I articulated earlier, but the moral case for compensation has been accepted, interim payments have been made, and work is ongoing across government on the basis of the interim report about how any future such compensation might be delivered.
The next questions pick up on that issue of waiting for the final report. You indicated that the government would always await the final report of an inquiry before acting. As I'm sure you'll appreciate, the Inquiries Act expressly empowers an inquiry to report on an interim basis. Otherwise, this and many other inquiries wouldn't have had the power so to do. What's the purpose of an interim report if the government will not act upon its content until a final report is delivered?
I can't remember the exact language used, but I think at the time it was acknowledged that it was an unusual step, the interim report's recommendations. I believe that was the word that was used, or it was a word similar to that. So I think the report itself acknowledged that the fact that it was an interim report making recommendations was unusual, and those interim recommendations were acted on within weeks. As a matter of general principle and historical precedent, good policy making and legal advice would suggest that it's important for government to have the full findings of an independent inquiry before making final decisions.
If it's government practice and precedent for the reasons you've referred to await the final report of an inquiry so that its recommendations could be considered in context, why did the government, as you've repeatedly referred to, choose to make substantial interim payments last summer without awaiting the final report? And surely the same considerations apply.
No, because I think the government at the time, which I was not a part of, so I wasn't part of that government decision-making process. I'd left government by that point. I think the government believed at that point that given those recommendations were specific and tightly defined, that it would be possible to do that, and it was the right thing to do, something that I agreed with at the time, but I wasn't in government, so I wasn't privy to the decision-making around that decision.
In relation to the recommendation that's in the second interim report, the most recent interim report, the recommendation of interim payments to parents and children, and leaving aside the other recommendations, which may be more complex in terms of the infrastructure of a compensation scheme, why why does the government need to see the inquiry's findings in context and work through the findings thoroughly in terms of considering the further recommendation for interim payments when the government was able to swiftly implement the first recommendation without working through the remainder of the inquiry's findings?
Again, I wasn't in government when that original decision was made, so I'm not able to speak to what happened. I wasn't a member of the government, didn't have access to those papers. I was a backbench MP at that time. And with regard to the second interim report, again, as the conversation we've had, matters of eligibility, scope, are all things that are under active consideration by government and part of the policy-making process that is underway and the MCO spoke to in detail.
The final area for questions is, I just want to go back to Ms Mordaunt's evidence and the question of legislation. Again, I'm just going to read what Ms Mordaunt told us. We're about to go into the fourth and final session of legislation. I know that's going to be a short session. There are carryover bills. Whilst there are policy areas still to be resolved and not questions that I can answer on that, what I can tell you is that in terms of this government and this Prime Minister's priorities going into that fourth session, this is one of his priorities. And you, I think, indicated that Ms Mordaunt was right to refer to the compensation payments as one of your priorities going into the fourth session. To clarify, and this is the question I'm asked to ask you, is it one of your priorities to introduce legislation on the compensation scheme in the fourth legislative session of this year?
I can't speak to the composition of the King's Speech in the fourth session legislation for obvious reasons. That's still something that government has to take a view on. I was talking more generally about this being a priority of mine for all the reasons that I've outlined previously in the session and the actions that the government has taken since I've become Prime Minister. I hope would demonstrate that it is something that I take seriously, that we have prioritised, and the seniority of the cabinet level attention it's had from the MCO, indeed my presence here today, and the work that has happened in government and the acceptance of the moral case are all demonstrations that this is a priority for me.
There may be a disconnect then between what you're saying to us and what Ms Mordaunt has said to us. Ms Mordaunt, obviously in her position as Leader of the House, is maybe in a position to deal with matters of proposed legislative sessions that you're not. It is important that people are not left confused about what the position is. So it is, I'm not asking you if you don't know the answer to give us an answer today. Is this a matter that you can, that further inquiries can be made just to confirm what the position is in that regard?
I can give you the position clearly now. Decisions on fourth session legislation have not been made. They are a matter as per usual government decision making through collective responsibility.
So are you saying to us that Ms Mordaunt was wrong in what she said?
No, I think, again, I can't speak for her, but as you read her evidence to me, she said that this was a priority for me. Yes, it is a priority for me. That is completely consistent with me also saying that decisions on fourth session legislation have not been made. I think those two things are entirely consistent.
So I'm not going to pursue that further now, but it may be a matter that the inquiry might want to consider whether for its own purposes, it needs any further clarity in relation to that. But I don't think I can sensibly take that matter further with the Prime Minister, given his answers. I'm just going to turn and see. There are no further matters that I'm asked to raise. Do you have any questions, Mr. Sunak?
I have no questions beyond those that I've already asked.
Mr. Sunak, is there anything that you wish to add?
I'll just, I think, conclude where I started, really, which is to acknowledge that this is and has been an appalling scandal. Many of you in this room, many watching, many others affected over a period of decades, not months or years. And those affected, as I said, is a broad group, not just those who were directly impacted, but their families, friends, carers as well. And I recognise that those layers of injustice have continued. This is not something that's only happened in the past. This is something that is still affecting families today. And when you read some of the testimonials that I referred to earlier as well, it's hard not to be enormously moved by them, as I am, and for the people who have come forward to talk about their experiences deserve our praise and our gratitude for doing so. It's not easy to talk about, for example, the social stigma that was attached to all of these things in years gone by, which I can't imagine what that was like to live with. I think one of your testimonies talked about someone losing their job as a result, and thankfully I hope we have moved on from that, but that would have been appalling, as well as a tragic loss of life. And I'm pleased to be able to be here today to participate in this inquiry's important work, which I fully support, which is why the government has fully supported the inquiry, and my determination is to deliver the appropriate redress and recognition that people need and deserve as quickly as thoroughness allows. And hopefully, whilst the wait has been long, people can see that there has been forward movement since the time I was Prime Minister, and that should give them some encouragement and hope that we will get this done.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Sir Brian.
Well, I thanked you at the beginning for making space in your calendar to come here today. You will realize, I think, now how important that is. It's important in particular because when I wrote my second interim report, which I recognized was an unusual step, given that there was no further evidence we had thought to be heard before the final report was drafted. Because, as I said, in conscience, I could not countenance there being any further delay on my part before the recommendations which I was making would be put into effect. I said that I thought there was no reason, given political will, why they could not be put into effect this year. You will realize that to everyone here, I think, it's one of the unfortunate aspects of being Prime Minister, you embody political will. And they will take away, I think, from the evidence you have given, the reassurances that you have said in terms, of course we will put it right, of course it's the case we are committed to compensation to those infected and affected. You have agreed that it is one of your priorities, it is a priority, and that word is a word of considerable importance. Not everything can be a priority. And you have endorsed Penny Mordaunt's wish to have it sorted on our shift, your government's shift. You will take away, I hope, the need for many to see tangible reassurance of that. You have pointed out that you have been one of the Prime Ministers who actually matched rhetoric with some action. On your shift, so far, we've had interim payments, albeit agreed before you came in, but you had committed yourself to them anyway in the course of the election campaign for that. You have pointed to the fact that you have been in charge of the government when it recognized the moral case for compensation as no previous government had done. And you have made it clear in what you have said today, right from the start, that you recognize the wrongs were done, and the way in which over so many years people's desires have been brushed aside by government. And that, you said, was wrong. You're speaking of previous governments, of all descriptions. They will be looking, I suspect, for yet further tangible recognition. They recognize the evidence they've heard this week of work being done. But there aren't any details. There is no timeline. There is no structure yet in place. If there is anything that you can, in the interim, do to reassure them, preferably by actions rather than by words, but either will do, actions preferably, that there will be the compensation which is just and fair, and it will be delivered as soon as possible. Because if it troubles my conscience, I would think it will trouble the conscience of a caring government. And you have said that's what you would wish to be. So, thank you for your evidence. You will see, you just had it demonstrated, the importance of what that means to people, and for the time that you have spent, as you have said, at short notice. It needs to be recognized, and that is some indication, some action that you've taken to honor those words. Thank you.
So just before we rise, and we're not sitting tomorrow, we are next sitting on Thursday afternoon to hear the evidence of the Chancellor of the Exchequer.
We will, however, consider...
Friday afternoon, I'm sorry.
We will, however, consider sitting where we are just for a little while longer to let the Prime Minister retire. Thank you very much.